Today, we're breaking down a really provocative analysis that predicts a new war in Iran isn't just some regional flare-up. Nope, it's supposedly the trigger for a complete overhaul of the global economy and who holds power.
Okay, so here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll get into the war itself and how it's predicted to escalate. Then, we'll explore the three huge economic shifts it could cause. After that, we'll look at the New World map of winners and losers, see what the future might hold for the West, and finally, we'll get into the most controversial part, the claim that this isn't random chaos, but a planned-out design.
So right at the heart of this argument is one core idea. Forget about a quick war. The prediction here is for a long, grinding war of attrition, a brutal slugfest that could drag on for years, because neither side can or will back down.
So, the big question is, how does a regional fight supposedly spiral into a global problem? Let's walk through the exact chain of events laid out in this analysis.
The source maps out a pretty chilling timeline. It starts with the kinds of strikes that are already being reported. From there, it's predicted to escalate fast, leading to massive disruptions in fuel and even our global food supply. Then the stakes get even higher. A fight for control of the Strait of Hormuz, which is absolutely critical, then the US sending in ground troops, and finally it explodes into a massive regional war, pulling in other big players. Now, according to the analysis, there was one single moment that supposedly slammed the door on any chance for peace. It claims the assassination of a key Iranian negotiator took the last off-ramp away, essentially locking both sides into this long, destructive path.
In this predicted conflict, the real weapon isn't just missiles, it's oil. The source argues that the main goal here is actually economic, to jack up the price of oil to $200 a barrel. You know, a price like that would send an absolute shockwave through a global economy that is built from the ground up on cheap energy.
So what happens if that cheap energy foundation just cracks? Well, the analysis says the entire global economy would be forced to change in three really fundamental and pretty dramatic ways.
Okay, first, deindustrialization. The idea is that our modern cities just can't function without cheap fuel and imported food, pushing people back to farming. Second, remilitarization. The era of the US basically being the world's policeman, Pax Americana, is seen as over, so nations have to start arming up to protect themselves. And third, mercantilism. With global trade all messed up, countries would have to scramble to build their own supply chains and become self-sufficient.
A global reset this big wouldn't just mess with our economies. It would totally redraw the map of world power. You'd have very clear winners and very clear losers. And this table here really lays it all out. On one side, you've got the predicted winners. Israel is listed as the main beneficiary. Russia, well, it cashes in on high oil prices. Japan is seen as culturally tough enough to handle it, and the Western Hemisphere as a whole has the resources to get by. But then you look at the other side, the losers. The Gulf nations, China's export-driven economy, and major industrial powers like South Korea and a lot of Europe, who all depend on that old system.
This analysis really singles out the Gulf Cooperation Council nations, the GCC, as the ones who lose the most. Their entire modern setup is called a mirage, something fragile that's only held up by the petrodollar and the US military. This predicted war supposedly shatters that illusion, and the whole image of places like Dubai being these super safe, stable hubs just vanishes.
Now, you'd probably think China would do just fine in a new world order, right? Well, this analysis argues the exact opposite. It calls China the least resilient major power. Why? Because its whole economic model, importing cheap energy to make stuff and then exporting it, completely falls apart when fuel is expensive and supply chains are broken.
So that brings us to the West. With all this chaos going on, what does the source predict is going to happen to North America, Europe, and Australia?
The picture painted for the West is one of stark contrast. On one hand, the Western Hemisphere could become this kind of self-sufficient fortress. The source even speculates the US might have to, in its words, colonize Canada for resources and Mexico for labor to keep it secure. But then it predicts a much darker future for Europe and Australia, describing it as a controlled demolition, where controversial policies are used to deliberately stir up internal conflict.
But even inside that so-called American fortress, the future isn't predicted to be all that peaceful. The analysis suggests that the enormous stress of this new world, maybe even a national draft for the war, could spark years of deep, internal sectarian violence right at home.
And this is where we get to the final, and let's be honest, the most provocative part of this whole thing. The claim that none of this is an accident. that it's all part of a deliberate, hidden plan.
Right at the center of this theory is the idea that the war's main beneficiary, Israel, is actually chasing a long-term goal, inspired by the Bible, something called the Greater Israel Project. The ambition being to control all the land from the Nile River all the way to the Euphrates.
Now, to really understand this argument, you need to know this one word: eschatology. It sounds complicated, but all it really means is the part of theology that deals with the end times. The source claims these aren't just old religious ideas, they're a powerful and often hidden force that's actively shaping real-world political and military moves today. And according to the source, these beliefs follow a very specific script, like a prophetic to-do list. Some steps, like the creation of Israel, are seen as already checked off. The analysis then claims that current events are being pushed in a certain direction to bring about the next steps, creating the right conditions to build a third temple in Jerusalem, sparking a final massive war, and ultimately paving the way for a Messiah. So in the end, we're left with the huge question this entire analysis forces us to ask. Are all these massive, world-changing events just the random, chaotic stumbles of history? Or, as this source provocatively suggests, are we actually watching someone follow a hidden script? It is for sure a challenging thought to leave you with.